and welcome to Foolish Musings. In this episode, we'll be examining the ancient Chinese philosopher Lao-tzu. So, who is Lao-tzu? Lao-tzu is a founding figure, or at least a semi-legendary founding figure within the philosophical and religious movement of Taoism. He was the author of one of the seminal works within this movement, being the Taoteching, and is believed to have lived at least some time maybe as early as the 6th century BCE, contemporaneous with Confucius, through to around about the 4th century BCE in the early Warring States period. According to traditional accounts, Lao-tzu was a scholar who was the keeper of archives in the royal court of the Zhao. Now, remember that Zhao is this system, a feudalistic system of Chinese rule which existed prior to the Jing, so the formalized imperial Chinese system followed by the Han, which we see after the Warring States period. And theoretically this gave him a broad access to the works of the Yellow Emperor, which are some of the classical works of ancient Chinese culture. However, Lao-tzu was able to make use of the country's great intellectual and academic assets. Now, it's stated that Lao-tzu saw the cultural and moral decline of the kingdom of Zhao, and at the age of 80 decided that he would go west to live as a hermit in the unsettled frontier. Some lineages, such as from Sima Qian, states that Lao-tzu actually came from the kingdom of Chu, which is an adjacent, more barbaric, at least by the contemporaneous standards of high Chinese culture, location, and Lao-tzu was heading west, away from the decadent centre, which he saw as a centre of corruption and decay. And when he was stopped by a border guard on his way out of Zhao-controlled territory, it was actually when he was asked to provide some sort of summation of his teachings by the border guard. This is what the Taoteching actually represents. Now, it should be noted that in the 20th century, a consensus has emerged amongst scholars that Lao-tzu was actually more of a legendary figure than a historic figure, and that the Taoteching is more so a combination of different early Taoist sayings and aphorisms. However, we do still see emergent arguments, on the other hand, suggesting that instead of trying to treat this text as a miscellaneous collection of different sayings from a tradition, we should treat it as a holistic text, because of not only the way in which the different parts seem to cohere together, but the fact that in later Chinese and, well, even today in Western societies, the Taoteching has an impact as a holistic text. Interesting and difficult history. So we have three main texts which have come down to us historiographically from writers who have written their own commentaries on the text. They included the original with that commentary. However, on top of this, we've also had some texts recovered in archaeological sites and excavations, written on silk and written on bamboo strips, and in both cases we see there is a significant difference between the text that is coming down to us, where there's certain omissions, certain additions, but also even the order of the chapters themselves are completely changed. Despite this, once again, I'd like to focus more so on the overarching unity between these different texts. We're not seeing necessarily a holistic and Unitarian piece of work, such as something you would see in Plato's dialogues. However, it should be noted that Plato's dialogues were studied with numerous spurious writings of other later Platonists who are pushing their own agenda or attempting to sell the latest and greatest lost Platonic work. But it should be seen that even though there is this complex textual history, the Taoteching itself does have an internal harmony which can be interpreted from numerous different angles. Even within the Chinese tradition, we see Taoism taking philosophical or religious bents, and then on the other hand, itself being absorbed and then utilized for their own purposes by Chinese legalists, who we'll discuss in a different lecture. So, let's begin with the most important concept in Taoism, which is the Tao. Now, as I said before, it loosely translates to the concept of the way. So, the mechanism by which one pursues going about one's life, or even just a road. However, it's more complex than that. Even within the actual text itself, it talks about the idea of the Tao as something that cannot be named, as in something that we cannot conceptualize, and in the fact that if we are able to conceptualize and describe it, we're not actually understanding what it is. The Tao that can be named is not the Tao. The Tao that can be walked is not the unchanging Tao. A quotation directly from the text. In some ways, it's useful to think of it in the same way of that Brahman-Atman divide within Indian philosophy and early Indian religion, Brahmanical religion, where if you think that you can perceive the Brahman, you're not really seeing the Brahman. You're once again just seeing another aspect of Atman, the perceivable, the interactable, the aspect of the changing, the ever mercurial world that we live in, as opposed to the eternal and the unchanging. In this sense, the Tao is the dark, fertile, unchanging eternity from which springs forth all of the living world with which we perceive. Now, the De, on the other hand, virtue, is an interesting concept within Taoism. So, we've talked about this conception of the Tao as the dark, the fertile, feminine thing from which the world comes. De is, for the Taoist, it's different. For Lao-tzu, De is definitely the way of virtue, the way of action, but in this sense he also sees it as, if not corruptive, at least definitely subordinate to the eternal and indescribable. So when Lao-tzu is describing virtue, in some of the text he actually talks about when people can fail to understand the Tao, or when they turn away from the Tao, they turn to De, they turn to virtue, and then from virtue they turn further downwards to punishment, to reward, to corruption, to defilement, and into decay. But at the same time, virtue, as in the virtuous life, as in living a life in accordance with the Tao, is a very important aspect of the literature. And it's something that needs to be understood within this context of living a virtuous life in the pursuit of the Tao. Now, these concepts of the Tao and the De, which are so central to the understanding the entirety of Taoism, or at least Taoism in the Lao-tzu context, that I think they merit further discussion in terms of some metaphors to try and tease out this very multifaceted, subtle, and in some ways intriguing, enigmatic concept. So one of the ways that I've seen the Tao explained is like a hill, and the dark side, the receding side of that hill, is the Tao, while the light and the bright side of the hill, highlighted by the sunlight or by moonlight, is the De. And it's this sort of conception that the Tao is that dark hill prior to illumination, and De, virtue, that life that we live, is only a facet that we can perceive, brought to light by some external source. But neither of them is really separate. They're one of the same thing, and in a sense, De is just generated by the Tao. Yet another analogy that I think is useful in terms of trying to unpack this concept of the Tao and the De is the field. So a barren field, devoid of all life, this is the Tao. This is the fertile underpinning of the Taoist conception of the universe. And then the De, or the living, or the virtue, and everything that comes from the De, everything that falls forth from that, is the flowers and the grass, the weeds, the trees, the shrubbery, everything that is springing forth from the Tao. And then if winter was to come and all these things were to die away and you just have a thin layer of snow coating everything, once again it would appear that the Tao is lifeless and dead. But this is only, once again, a perception, because with the coming of summer, the warmth returns, and the De, the virtue, all these things spring forth once again of this generative substance, the Tao underneath. Now, I don't want to necessarily highlight a sort of cyclic conception of the world in this sense, because definitely within the conception of Taoism, as put forth by the Tao-te-Ching, it seems like there's a creative moment. I'll discuss that a little bit later, but you've got a sort of a point in time where everything comes forth from the Tao, rather than a cyclic procession, as something we see more in that sort of Jain or Brahmanic or Buddhist conception of the universe. So when we take into understanding these concepts of Tao and De, the concept of creation in the Lao-tzuian sense, in the Tao-te-Ching, begins to take shape. We talk about in one of the passages, first there is the One, which is the Tao, the unnameable, the uncomprehendable concept, the dark, the generative aspect, the feminine aspect. And then there is two, because with the Tao it generates the De, that virtue, that mechanism of life. And then there is three, when you have the admixture of these two substances, the Tao and the De. And then from this admixture of the dark and the light, the masculine and the feminine, the impermanent and the changeable with the immutable and the everlasting, you have the creation of the 10,000 things, the different aspects of the perceivable world that we interact with on a day-to-day basis. And it's sort of this conception of the unchanging underlying substrate of the Tao, which forms that generative background from which all things appear, that is so important to understand within the Tao-te-Ching, but within the context of Lao-tzuian creation and metaphysics. Lao-tzu's conception of metaphysics heavily influences this sort of epistemologic question of what do we perceive and what do we see. The thing I want to highlight for Lao-tzu and within the text of the Tao-te-Ching is the constant reinforcement of the idea that what we can see, what we can perceive, and what we can describe is not the true reality. What is the De? What is the thing that we interact with and the thing that we can actively push out and sort of describe using words, using language, using poetry? That is not the Tao. And it's interesting because this is sort of an acknowledgement that the text itself is unable to directly present the Tao to the reader. It's more of an invitation, an exhortation to focus oneself, to use one's energies instead to focus upon trying to unravel and understand the Tao internal to one's own mind. So rather a push towards internal conception as opposed to perception. So now that we've examined the metaphysical underpinnings of Lao-tzu's philosophy of early Taoism, it's important to now look at what are the political and the ethical sort of outcomes of this philosophy. So for Lao-tzu, it was kind of a very interesting conception that we should be aiming not for a unnatural, forced way of life. So not something that you would see in the conception of the life of a Confucian, where someone who's very much focused on that idea of refinement, on culture, on one's place in society, and one's standing with one's family, but rather much more focused instead on living a natural life, on living the life free of these bonds of culture and free of these sort of preconceptions and sort of in Lao-tzu's understanding, these corrupt and degenerate, overly decadent ideas of the urbane city-states and kings that existed in early Chinese history, in and around this spring and autumn, and in and around the Warring States period. Rather, we see this focus on a simple life, on a life not dissimilar to that was lived in earlier days, sort of a rustic, a romanticized conception of the peasant life. And for Lao-tzu, he was this focus on almost like a primitivist conception. One of the best ways to describe it is the idea of the uncarved block. It's this idea that one should not live one's life trying to refine oneself, to turn oneself into a beautiful piece of furniture, turn oneself into an ornate decoration, but rather live life instead as the being you truly are, to get back to that natural prime, as close to what your true essence and your true nature is. In that sense, transcending the petty morality and ethical principles which have been manufactured and created within this more decadent urbane system. So out of this primitivistic, I would say, conception of reality, what are the ethical precepts that come out? So for Lao-tzu and within the Tao-te-Ching, it would appear that ethics is more so about an attempt to live a naturalistic life rather than a prescriptive attempt to create a sort of list of do's and don'ts. Not a legalistic understanding in terms of law codes, in terms of thou shalt or thou shalt not, but rather sort of a admonishment, an exhortation to return to a more primitivistic, a sort of a romanticized conception of the peasant life, and a life sort of free of these over-inflated, overly decadent conceptions of what it is meant to be, to do right and wrong. In some ways, the Tao-te-Ching almost seems a bit more as an exhortation to the rulers of states. We'll talk about the political implications a bit later. But if we're talking about these ethics, it's interesting because in some ways the Tao-te-Ching kind of insinuates that as soon as you start trying to enforce ethics, you immediately start moving away from the Tao. You're moving away from the way. It's this idea that as soon as something must be enforced, you're going to create the opposite reaction. It's about, like, an equal, in some ways a bit of a Newtonian sense. With every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. As soon as you start dividing things up, as soon as you start having rich people, then you're going to have people that are converters of that richness. As soon as you start having honors, you're going to have people that are jealous of the honors that are bestowed to some people but not to others. And rather, in this ethical system, it's about living a naturalistic life away from the decadence and away from this overly ornate system which has been risen up in the Zhao and the late Zhao, and then I suppose later on in Middle Chinese and Imperial Chinese history. It's interesting because once again it leans back to that metaphysical conception that the Tao, that underlying substrate, is the one and unchanging. And as soon as one starts focusing on the ephemeral, the constantly changing De, the light, those things of material life that are constantly fluctuating, one's moving away from the Tao. And in a sense, it's very much a conception of a naturalistic life. One needs to get back to one's nature and away from the affected and pretentious systems of morality that are described within the more ornate aspects of Chinese civilization. So, what is the political ramifications of Lao-tzu's ethics? Well, in some ways, Lao-tzu is a utopian. He can be conceived of as someone who's harkening back to this romantic idea of the peasant, of someone who's living without writing, without those hard lines of imperially enforced ethics of political fealty, without the corrupting influence of the central state. And it's very easy to have a primitivistic, almost a primitive communalistic conception of what Lao-tzu means within his own political philosophy, and he's trying to get us to reach back to this bygone era of what it was like prior to the highly ornate, stratified, and ceremonial society of the imperial court and of Chinese high culture. And we can see this in the admonishments that he makes towards those that would read his texts as a handbook for ruling a country. He talks about the fact that one should reject the money, reject the riches, reject the honours that should be bestowed by a central state upon those who show merit and loyalty, and instead treating everyone equally, so as to prevent crime, prevent dishonour, prevent jealousy. And he also talks about warfare as being a tool that should only be taken up reluctantly, rather than attempting to carve out an empire with the strength of one's sword arm. Instead, one should only wage enough effort so as to defend one's territory and then go no further. And this is an interesting aspect because it's something that's sort of laid throughout all of Lao-tzu's philosophy. It's that idea of minimal effort, of being minimally impactive upon oneself, upon the world, and upon those around you. And in some ways, one could almost describe Lao-tzu as an early hippie, as someone who sees, being very cool, very calm, collected, never over-exerting oneself, putting in just enough effort as required for the task, and then no more, ceasing. This conception of the utopian life, of living a very primitivistic agricultural life in a small village, without writing, without all these firm precepts of law, of order, of culture, and instead just embracing a naturalistic life, it has a lot of attraction to people that sort of have this very Rousseauian conception of, the world is corrupting, the civilization is corrupting upon the nature of humans, upon the nature of man, but at the same time has a lot of detractors, as people who instead see the benefits of modern civilization, as particularly, medicine, education, removing the veil of ignorance as something as a positive development. And so modern Western progressivists could definitely have something that they're not keen on seeing in Lao-tzuian, what they would describe as anti-scientism, and even a romantic pressing of ignorance over and emotion over a scientific empirical understanding. So, what are we to make of Lao-tzu and the Taoteching? I would argue that one of the most important things to remember, besides Lao-tzu being a true classic in the sense that it's something that can really give anything to the reader, regardless of the culture they come from, regardless of the historical age they come from, it remains an interesting counterpoint to the Confucian conception of the world, and in some ways a healthy reminder of those who would like to see a simplistic, one-dimensional understanding of early Chinese culture as being sort of beholden to this very ritualistic, overly ornate, deferential, hierarchical system that then, through some weird blending of a cultural paradigm and ethnic determinism, saw a playing out of Chinese history along the lines of not only what we've seen historically, but into the hands of the modern PRC and the authoritarian state. Lao-tzu instead provides a healthy dose of skepticism of those hard cultural realities that some people see as built into the Chinese paradigm, and at the same time can be used as almost like a paint stripper to tear away our own conceptions of the own narrativistic flow of Western philosophy and Western ideology, and break down those structures. I think that these very aphoristic style and the very ambiguous style of the Taoteching allows for not only multiple interpretations and multiple readings, but means that the text repays rereading. The text repays the effort that the individual puts back into it, examining the differing facets of the thought and the potential ideas that are being put forward by the author. And in some ways, I think that is magical, because it almost plays out those central conceptions of the Tao and the De, like a multifaceted object, something that cannot be truly described through words, but must sort of be teased out in almost like a dialectical style between the reader and the text itself. And with this in mind, I would once again highly encourage anyone who is listening to this to look on the internet. You can find many different copies of the Taoteching and read it a few times. It's quite a short text. It was only about 5,000 characters in the original Chinese, but whatever effort you put into this particular book within the Taoteching and trying to understand Lao-tzu's thought will repay you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Foolish Musings. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe for more or follow me at my blog at foolishmusings.com.